A CEO mocks a waitress for her broken English, thinking he's above her. But when she responds in flawless German, his arrogance shatters. What happens next will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about respect and humility. Stay tuned to find out how one moment changed it all. The evening was bustling in the upscale restaurant, a place known for its fine dining and clientele of the rich and powerful. The dimly lit ambience, with crystal chandeliers casting a soft glow, created an air of exclusivity. The murmur of quiet conversations, the clink of wine glasses, and the subtle sounds of waiters moving between tables set the backdrop for what would turn out to be an unforgettable evening for the CEO and his associates. At a corner table, the CEO of a large corporation sat, flanked by a few business partners. He exuded confidence, his suit perfectly tailored, his posture impeccable. He had worked hard for his wealth, and now he relished in it. It was the kind of power that made people bow, that made them respect him before he even opened his mouth. The air around him was thick with arrogance, and to him, there was nothing more exhilarating than displaying his superiority. The table was filled with laughter as his colleagues shared stories about their latest business ventures, their faces lighting up with excitement over the lucrative deals they were discussing. The CEO enjoyed the attention, soaking it all in. To him, it was all part of the game. He was the king, and they were merely his subjects. And then she walked in. The waitress, a young woman who seemed out of place in the lavish setting, approached the table. She was nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she held her notepad. Her uniform, though neat, couldn't match the pristine surroundings. Her accent was thick, her words a little hesitant. She was from a different world, one of hard work and humility, not the world of boardrooms and power suits. "Good evening, sir," she greeted, her voice soft but polite. "How can I help you tonight?" The CEO glanced up at her, his eyes narrowing. Her English was far from perfect, and he couldn't resist the urge to make her the subject of his amusement. He was used to people speaking perfect English, the kind of language that matched his stature. She didn't fit into his idealized version of what a person of her position should be. A smirk spread across his face as he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Well, isn't that adorable?" he said, loud enough for his colleagues to hear. "That's some impressive English you've got there. Did you learn that at a school for waitresses?" The table fell silent for a brief moment, and then, as if on cue, his colleagues erupted into laughter. The CEO reveled in the sound, feeling the rush of superiority course through him. They were all in on the joke now, the laughter echoing through the restaurant. The waitress stood still, her face flushing with embarrassment. She had expected some teasing, but this was more than just a harmless jab. His tone, his words, were dripping with condescension. But she didn't let it show. She forced a smile, trying to hide the sting of his words. She had been in this job long enough to know that people like him existed, people who thought they were better than everyone else. "I'm sorry, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the discomfort she felt. "Is there anything else I can do for you?" The CEO didn't stop. "Well, for starters," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife, "you could actually learn to speak proper English. I'm sure that would help you in your line of work." The laughter around the table grew louder. The CEO leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of his wine, completely oblivious to the growing discomfort in the room. His colleagues had stopped laughing, but they didn't speak up. After all, they were just as complicit in this moment of mockery. The waitress, however, was no longer listening. Her mind raced, but outwardly she maintained her composure. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, the judgment in the air, but she didn't let it break her. Instead, she turned and walked away, her back straight and her steps deliberate. She wasn't going to let them see her falter. As she moved to the counter, her face was flushed with the sting of humiliation. She was used to people making jokes at her expense, but something about the CEO's words felt different. It wasn't just the mocking of her English shit, was the assumption that someone in her position couldn't be more than what they appeared to be. It was the assumption that she was somehow inferior, but she didn't let it show. She returned to the kitchen, and though her heart raced, her mind was clear. She had faced moments like this before, but this time, something inside her stirred. It wasn't just about the mockery, it was about the realization that she had nothing to prove to people like him. She didn't need their validation. She didn't need anyone to define her worth. Back at the table, the CEO and his colleagues continued their meal. The laughter eventually died down, but the tension in the air lingered. The CEO was blissfully unaware that he had crossed a line. To him, this was just another moment of exerting his power, but to the others at the table, the scene felt uncomfortable. They exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke up. The CEO was their boss, after all. As the night went on, the CEO felt a sense of triumph. He had made the waitress the joke of the evening, and everyone had laughed along with him, but deep inside, there was a gnawing feeling that he couldn't quite shake off. It was the realization that he had made an assumption about her, based solely on her job and the way she spoke. It was the kind of assumption that people like him often made, an assumption that someone in her position couldn't possibly be as educated, as capable, or as intelligent as he was. The dinner continued, but the CEO's mind wasn't fully on the deals being discussed. Every time he thought about the waitress, a small part of him felt unsettled, and though he tried to brush it off, he couldn't ignore the sense of discomfort that had settled inside him. He had no idea that the very person he had mocked would soon teach him a lesson he would never forget. He had no idea that this was only the beginning of a story that would leave him speechless. The next day, the CEO walked into the same restaurant. The laughter from the previous evening had faded, but a lingering feeling of discomfort still followed him. He couldn't shake the image of the waitress from his mind, her calm demeanor. In the face of mockery, the way she had accepted his harsh words with grace. He had expected her to react differently, perhaps with anger or a flustered apology. But instead, she had walked away with her dignity intact, and for some reason, that left him unsettled. As he entered the restaurant, he spotted her right away. She was busy serving other customers, moving with efficiency and purpose. For a moment, he considered approaching her, maybe saying something to make amends. But the CEO quickly dismissed the thought. He had no reason to apologize. She had been a good sport, hadn't she? After all, she had just been doing her job. But when the waitress finally approached his table, something inside him shifted. She was standing before him, taking his order with the same professionalism as before. She greeted him with a calm, "Good evening, sir," and began to list the options for the night's specials. Her accent was still noticeable, but this time it didn't seem as bothersome to him. Perhaps it was because, in the back of his mind, he was already reflecting on his behavior from the night before. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt embarrassed by his own actions. "Good evening," he responded, trying to act as though the events of the previous night hadn't happened. "How's the soup tonight?" "It's a new recipe," she replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "I think you'll enjoy it." There was a pause, and the CEO noticed something different in her eyes. It wasn't just the usual politeness. he saw in waitstaff was something more, something he hadn't seen before. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence she carried with her. Her smile wasn't just an automatic response to a customer's question. It was genuine. He decided to ask her something. "Do you speak any other languages?" He said casually, unsure of why he was even asking. She looked at him, and for a moment, he could see a flash of hesitation in her eyes, almost as if she was deciding how much to reveal. Finally, she said, "Yes, I speak German fluently and a little bit of French." The CEO froze for a moment. German. His mind raced. She didn't look like someone who could speak multiple languages. He had already written her off, judging her based solely on her job and accent. Now, he felt a mix of surprise and embarrassment. His assumptions about her were quickly crumbling. He didn't know how to respond. It was as if he had been caught in his own ignorance. He had been so quick to judge her the night before, but now, faced with the reality of her talents, he was left speechless. Impressive, he finally managed, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. The waitress gave him a small nod, but her expression was neutral. She wasn't gloating about her knowledge. She was simply stating the truth. "Thank you, sir," she said, before moving on to take the next order. As she walked away, the CEO leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. For the first time in a long while, he felt humbled. He had assumed she was nothing more than a simple waitress, someone with limited abilities, but in reality, she had just exposed the limitations of his own perspective. As the night wore on, he found himself reflecting on his past behavior, his judgmental attitude, and the arrogance that had defined his actions. How many times had he done this before? How many people had he looked down upon, assuming they didn't have the intelligence or skills he did? In the following days, he found himself thinking about the waitress more and more. She had unknowingly forced him to confront his own flaws, and it bothered him. It bothered him because he had always considered himself open-minded. But now he realized just how easily he had fallen into the trap of superficial judgment. The next time he saw her, he decided he would say something to acknowledge his mistake. But for now, he sat in his chair, realizing that the power of her simple words had already begun to change him. The days after the encounter with the waitress weighed heavily on the CEO's mind. He found himself replaying that moment over and over again. Her calm demeanor, her composed smile, and the way she had responded to his mockery with nothing but quiet dignity. He had made a mistake, one he couldn't easily shake off. His usual arrogance, the part of him that saw himself as superior, had suddenly felt misplaced. It was a troubling realization for someone who had lived his entire life with the belief that people like him were above the rest, those who worked in offices, made decisions, and were well versed in the complexities of the world. People like him were supposed to be the ones who commanded respect, who held the power. And then there was the waitress, whose mere words had stripped him of his comfort zone and made him feel like a fool. He began to question everything. How many other people had he looked down on simply because they didn't fit the mold he had created in his mind? How many had he dismissed based on superficial judgments, on accents, on appearances, on social standing? The more he thought about it, the more it disturbed him. He had made a career out of being sharp, decisive, and confident. But now he was left with a sense of doubt about his own actions, his assumptions, and the way he had treated people in the past. The waitress hadn't just caught him off guard. She had exposed his flaws. She had revealed the hypocrisy he had been living with, and that knowledge gnawed at him. In the following days, he found it difficult to focus on work. His meetings seemed to drag on, and even the most pressing business deals felt unimportant. His colleagues noticed the change in him, though none of them spoke up. They had always seen him as the unshakable leader, the one who always knew what to do. Now they saw a side of him they hadn't witnessed before: hesitation. He couldn't stop thinking about the waitress. Her ability to remain calm in the face of his cruelty spoke volumes about her character. It wasn't just that she had spoken multiple languages. It was her quiet strength that had left a lasting impression. He had assumed she was nothing more than a person in a service job, someone who couldn't possibly have the knowledge or grace he had. But she had shattered that image, leaving him to confront his own arrogance. One afternoon, a few days after their last encounter, the CEO found himself sitting alone in his office. The room was filled with the soft hum of the air conditioner and the faint sound of traffic from outside. He wasn't working, he was thinking. He was thinking about the waitress and the lesson she had unknowingly taught him. It had been a long time since he had felt any true sense of humility, and the feeling was foreign to him. His mind kept circling back to her calm response, to her unshaken composure. She had never raised her voice, never fought back. She had simply been herself, confident in her own knowledge, without needing anyone else's approval. His thoughts were interrupted when his assistant knocked on the door, bringing him a coffee. "Sir, there's a call from the restaurant," she said. "They're asking if you'll be returning tonight." The mention of the restaurant immediately caught his attention. He hadn't planned on going back. The last time he was there, he had embarrassed himself in front of his colleagues and the staff. But now, the thought of returning felt different. Maybe it was time to face the music, to apologize for the way he had treated the waitress. "Tell them I'll be there," he said, making a decision in that moment. His tone was more serious than usual. That evening, the CEO entered the restaurant. Once again, a quiet determination behind his steps. The air inside felt warmer than usual, the noise of the dinner crowd filling the space. He approached the host who, with a warm smile, led him to the same corner table. As he walked through the restaurant, he spotted her. The waitress was busy serving another table, moving gracefully between customers, her expression focused but calm. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. He couldn't just walk up and apologize. No, it had to be more sincere than that. He sat down at his table and waited, giving himself a moment to gather his thoughts. He watched the waitress in silence, her interactions with other customers smooth and efficient. He couldn't help but feel a sense of respect growing within him. There was no arrogance in her, no self-promotion. She simply existed in her own quiet space, untouched by the judgments of others. When she came to his table to take his order, he took a deep breath and looked up at her. "Good evening," he said, his voice much softer than before. She nodded, offering the same polite smile she always gave. "Good evening, sir. How may I help you tonight?" The CEO swallowed his pride, the words coming out slower than usual. "I owe you an apology for what happened the other night," he said, his gaze steady but sincere. "I shouldn't have mocked you. That was wrong of me. You didn't deserve it." The waitress didn't seem surprised by the apology. She stood still for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice calm. "I appreciate your apology, sir. It wasn't much, but it was enough." The CEO felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He had acknowledged his mistake, and in doing so, he felt a small sense of redemption. But more than that, he had come to realize that this simple moment was more significant than any deal he had ever signed, or any business meeting he had attended. He wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, he knew he was a different person. The CEO's decision to return to the restaurant had been a difficult one. The arrogance that had once been such a strong part of his character had, over the past few days, begun to unravel. He knew that the best way to face his mistake was to return to the place where it all began. He didn't know if the waitress would accept his apology, but he knew he had to try. As he sat at his table that evening, waiting for the waitress to approach, he reflected on how the last few days had changed him. His usual sharp, confident demeanor felt out of place now, replaced with a quiet humility that he had never experienced before. It wasn't just about the words he had said to her or the mockery he had made it was about the assumption he had made that because of her job, because of her accent, she was somehow less than he was. It was a lesson in humility, and it was one he wasn't going to forget anytime soon. When the waitress approached his table, the CEO could feel his heart racing. He had rehearsed his apology in his mind over and over again, but now that the moment had arrived, he felt unsure of how to begin. She was standing before him, her eyes as calm and collected as ever. She smiled politely but didn't speak immediately, waiting for him to begin. "Good evening," he said softly, his voice betraying the hesitation he felt. "I want to apologize for what happened the other night. I said some things that were wrong. I made assumptions about you, and that was unfair." The waitress didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood there, her eyes steady, as if she were taking in his words, weighing them carefully. After a few moments of silence, she nodded once, the slightest hint of a smile crossing her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm and even. "I appreciate your apology, sir." Her response was measured, professional, but it carried an air of dignity that he hadn't expected. He had imagined that she might be angry or resentful, but instead she was simply composed. There was no need for her to raise her voice. No need for her to make him feel guilty. She had already shown him the power of silence, the power of remaining unshaken in the face of mockery. The CEO couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for her in that moment. She had been the target of his jokes, his mockery, and yet she had remained unbothered, unaffected by his cruelty. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that her response to him had been one of quiet strength. It was a strength that he hadn't seen in many of the people he knew. In fact, it was the kind of strength he had been lacking all along. "I want you to know that I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he continued, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "And I've come to realize how wrong I was to treat you that way. I should have respected you from the beginning, no matter what your accent was or what job you have. I was wrong, and I'm truly sorry." The waitress nodded again, acknowledging his sincerity, but her expression remained calm. She wasn't looking for an apology to make her feel better. She wasn't looking for him to grovel. She was simply acknowledging his effort to make things right. "Thank you," she repeated, her tone still polite, but now with a slight warmth in it. "I appreciate it, but there's no need to apologize. We all make mistakes. What's important is that you've learned from it." Her words hit him harder than he had expected. In her simplicity, she had just given him a life lesson. It wasn't about the apology. It was about learning and growing from the experience. She wasn't angry with him, and she wasn't holding a grudge. She had accepted his apology because, for her, the moment of learning had already passed. She had already moved on. For the first time in days, the CEO felt a genuine sense of relief. He had expected the apology to be a difficult task, one that would be met with resistance, or, at the very least, some kind of emotional reaction. Instead, it had been met with grace. He didn't deserve it, but he had received it nonetheless. And in that moment, he realized that her grace had taught him more than any lecture or business meeting ever could. The conversation continued, but it was no longer about business or mockery. It was about respect. The CEO, who had once felt so invincible in his power, now found himself humbled by a simple interaction. The waitress, who had been the subject of his ridicule, had become a symbol of everything he had been blind to: humility, respect, and the power of quiet strength. As the evening came to a close, the CEO stood up from his seat, ready to leave. He had come to the restaurant expecting to make things right, but he had left with something much more valuable. He had learned a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Before he left, he turned to the waitress one last time. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." She smiled, her eyes kind. "You're welcome, sir," she replied. "Take care." And with that, the CEO walked out of the restaurant, a changed man. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he would never look at people the same way again. Months passed since that night, and the CEO's life took on a new direction. The experience at the restaurant, the mockery, the humbling apology, and the quiet strength of the waitress had changed him in ways he could never have imagined. He had learned a hard lesson that night, one that had shaken the very foundations of his arrogance. And while he was still the CEO of a successful company, he now carried himself differently. There was a humility in his posture, a quiet thoughtfulness in his interactions with others. He no longer judged people based on their appearance or their positions. He had learned to listen first, to respect first, before making any assumptions. One day, while he was in a meeting with his management team, the topic of hiring came up. They were discussing a new role within the company, someone who would be in charge of customer service. As the discussion went on, the CEO found himself thinking about the waitress from that night. Her poise, her professionalism, her ability to remain unshaken in the face of mockery, it all came rushing back to him. "I think we should prioritize character over experience," he said, surprising his team. "We're looking for someone who can embody the values of this company: respect, humility, and strength under pressure. Experience is important, but it's not everything." His team exchanged glances, unsure of what had prompted the sudden shift in his attitude. The CEO had always been known for his sharp business acumen, his ability to make decisions quickly and decisively, but today his approach was different. There was something more thoughtful in his words, something deeper. "We need people who understand that success is about more than just making deals or hitting numbers," he continued. "It's about how we treat others, how we build relationships, and how we respect those who may not have the same advantages or opportunities we do. It's about recognizing the potential in others and helping them grow." The team nodded, clearly impressed by the CEO's new perspective. They had never heard him speak like this before. It was clear that something had changed within him. And though they didn't know the full story, they could see that the CEO had learned something important, something that would affect how he led the company from then on. A few weeks later, the CEO found himself at a charity event, representing his company and speaking to an audience of young professionals. He was invited to give a short speech about leadership and success, and as he took the stage, he felt a familiar sense of nervousness. But this time, it wasn't because of the pressure to perform. It was because he knew that he was no longer the person who had once spoken with arrogance. He was a different man now. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "I've been asked to talk about success and leadership, and for most of my career, I've believed that success is all about hard work, smart decisions, and, yes, sometimes luck. But there's something else I've come to realize." He paused, looking out over the audience. He could see young faces, eager to hear his words, some of them perhaps idolizing him for his success, just as he had once idolized others. But he knew now that there was something more important than just business accomplishments. Success is also about respect. Respect for others, respect for ourselves, and respect for the journey. It's about recognizing the value in every person you meet, regardless of their title or position. It's about understanding that we are all, at the end of the day, human beings, and we all deserve to be treated with dignity. There was a silence in the room as the audience took in his words. The CEO continued, his voice growing more passionate. "I used to think that being at the top of the ladder meant being better than everyone else. I used to think that success meant looking down on others, judging them based on their background, their job, or their appearance. But I've learned that true leadership is about lifting others up, not tearing them down." The audience was quiet, listening intently. The CEO's words were different from what they had expected, but there was an honesty in them that resonated deeply. He wasn't just talking about business, he was talking about life. As leaders, we have the power to change the world, but we can't do it alone. We can't do it by keeping others down. We do it by building people up, by helping them find their voice, by showing them that they are valued. We do it by recognizing their potential, just as we should recognize our own. The speech ended to a round of applause, and as he stepped down from the stage, the CEO felt a sense of accomplishment that he hadn't experienced before. It wasn't about the applause or the recognition. It was about knowing that, in that moment, he had said something that came from the heart. As he walked out of the venue, he thought about the waitress again. He had never gotten the chance to thank her properly, but he now realized that she had taught him something far more valuable than any business lesson he had learned in his career. She had shown him what it meant to be truly humble, to respect others, and to lead with kindness. The CEO made a decision that night. He would take action on the values he had just spoken about. He would continue to grow, to learn, and to lead with respect, and he would never forget the lesson he had learned from the waitress, the one who had unknowingly changed his life forever.